Hello, and welcome to the inaugural Barry K. Memorial Lecture. I'm Andrea Brown, the chair of Laurier's Political Science Department. This event has been organized by the Political Science Department, Barry's wife, Betty Leventhal, the Laurier Center for Strategic and Disarmament Studies, and Liz Pop, the Laurier Institute for Studies in Public Opinion and Polling. Many of you here today knew Barry. You may have known him through his scholarship and frequent contributions to local and national media with his op-eds, radio interviews, and televised appearances. Barry made important contributions to the field of electoral data polling analysis with his seat projection model. He published more than 40 articles and wrote hundreds of editorials. Because Barry's knowledge of the US political scene was encyclopedic and included little-known tidbits about candidates and local context, he was able to explain election results with the dramas behind them, captivating his audiences. We lost Barry almost a year ago, and we miss him every day, but at no time more than during an election. And what an election this one has been. Barry would have loved every second of it. Barry was a faculty member in the Department of Political Science for 41 years. Many of you will know how enormously generous he was. Barry was always interested in his friends and his colleagues' families and lives. He always returned from a trip with gifts, such as calendars, chocolates, baseball hats. The calendars from Hawaii, usually received in the dead of winter, were not perhaps as appreciated as the candy from Trader Joe's. As the department baseball committee, Barry kept us connected by organizing trips to baseball games, whirly ball, dinners in Toronto and Waterloo. He anonymously paid for our seasonal department get-togethers, including last December's, which he was unable to attend. There's a huge hole in our department without him. At election time, Barry's friends and colleagues would gather at his and Betty's home to watch the results come in. I've been at Laurier for 20 years and never missed this opportunity. This lecture series is no substitute, but we hope that bringing Barry's students, friends, and colleagues together for this event and future events in this series allows us to honor his legacy and his friendship. I'll now turn the Zoom over to Kristin Mead, a fourth-year student in our honors program, who will be moderating our discussion today.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Dr. Brown said, my name is Kristin Mead, and I am a fourth-year honors political science student at Laurier. I am honored to be here today as just one of the many students that have had the opportunity to learn from and work with Dr. Barry K. Dr. K's passion for electoral politics radiates so brightly that it is impossible as a student to not be inspired. His commitment to working with students, ensuring their successes, and maximizing their learning opportunities, both inside and outside of the classroom, are sentiments echoed again and again by those fortunate enough to have known him. I am so excited for our discussion today, as we are so fortunate to have two incredible panelists with us who are excited to explore the results of the US election from a cross-border perspective. Our first panelist today is Dr. Christopher Borick, who is a professor of political science and also the director of the Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion in Pennsylvania. Our second panelist is Dr. Debora VanNijnatten, professor of political science and North American studies here at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario. Throughout our conversation today, we encourage you to use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask any questions you may have for our panelists. Dr. Brown and I will be monitoring that forum and relaying your questions to our panelists who are so eager to answer them. Dr. VanNijnatten, Dr. Borick, why don't we start off today with each of you letting me know if there was anything surprising about the results of the past US election?
First of all, thank you so much, Kristin and Dr. Brown and all the folks that have put this event together to honor Barry. I am absolutely honored to be able to be in this first of what I hope is annual talks to celebrate his life and his interest. And I could only imagine, looking at the American election this year and thinking about it from his perspective with those years of investment and interest and engagement, and what that would have been like. So we're at a loss in many ways, but I would have loved to hear those perspectives today. And so what's surprising, right? I guess one of the things to me that, as an American politics analyst and pollster, looking at this race, was, in some ways, the presidential race was only marginally different than 2016 when you start to get into the state-by-state data. The cross tabs are available about voter demographics. But the outcome, it couldn't be any different, right? As you look at it with the change of administrations coming in the US. So it's one of those where lots of modest things added up to something very, very big in terms of the outcome. So I don't know if that was particularly surprising. The surprising thing to me in many ways was the lack of alignment with down ballot seats that we saw across the US this time. And maybe Debora will speak to that too. But the idea that there were certainly no coattails that we might see as part of American politics and other political systems where the top of the ticket takes along others. In fact, it seems that it was perhaps just a little bit in the opposite direction. So no wave election in the US this year. I didn't think there was a wave. In all my talks before, all my discussions before, I said there's nothing to give me the indication of a wave. But I thought if there was any kind of modest current going this time, it might have been in the direction of US senators and our Democrats in the Senate races and the House races. But if anything, it might have even ebbed a little bit to the Republicans, especially in the House. So if I had to take one kind of surprising aspect of the race, it would be in those congressional races.
So, I'll chime in here and say, I'm going to agree with a lot of what Chris said, but I have to say that I was surprised by the depth of support for Trump all across the country. So, I shouldn't have been. And my second thought as the results were coming in was that this is not going to go away. So it's really incumbent on, folks who are watching American politics from north of the border to really try to figure out why this is the case. And I'm sure Chris, with some of his polling or looking at things that his colleagues have done, will be able to offer some insights here into what drives the aspirations and sentiments of those who are loyal Trump supporters. And those that may not be particularly loyal, but vote for Trump anyway. Very interested to hear some of those insights. Second surprise was how Hispanics voted. So some of the increased support for Trump among Hispanic communities in some parts of the country, including the South. And, it made me think about the saleability of some parts of the progressive agenda and how once that socialist label gets sort of stamped on something, it tends to stick. And then the third thing was really Barry inspired. And when I was watching the results come in and as I was preparing for the election, Barry and I used to talk about specific districts, and I will not pretend that I knew anything like he did, but I would say, what districts are you watching to give you an indication of what's going to happen. And so he always had, 5 or 6 that he was watching in particular, but he was watching all of them. He knew what was going on everywhere. And it's the same in Canadian elections. So he always knew what was going on at the riding level, right? And he could explain, as Kristin was saying, some of the drama that underlay some of those election stories. But I was watching particular races from the beginning. And what I did is I went through all the talking heads, some of the analysts who go on 538 and what districts are they watching and what are they saying? And so I made a list of the ones where, Chris, they were actually predicting, flips or, they thought were very competitive and that we're going to go Democratic. So I was watching like the 3rd Congressional District in Michigan, the 6th district in Arizona. And that was the, that crazy story with Dave Schweikert, who had a load of ethics violations. He'd run out of money, and I thought, oh, he's going down. The 8th district in North Carolina, I was watching that one as well. The 10th in Pennsylvania, Republicans took them all. And that to me really indicated, I just want to echo what Chris said, that a sizable portion of voters split their ticket. So they voted, on the presidential ballot one way, but down ballot, they were quite comfortable supporting Republicans. And I think that's going to set up some really complex tensions in Congress. So, we can talk about what that means in terms of the next 4 years.
What great thoughts to get us started today. Thank you so much. The next question that I think both of you may be able to offer some unique insight on is, so what are the takeaways from these results? What might this mean for the new administration going forward?
I'll let Debora, since I took the first crack at the last one, I'll let her set the table and I'll react to her this time.
Okay, well, so my perspective is a Canadian who does Canada-US relations, right? And so I'm looking at this thinking, what does this mean for us? And so, Chris will have a different perspective. And that's one of the reasons we set it up like this, right? So that we could have these different perspectives across the border in thinking about the next 4 years. Now, Obama demonstrated, and as did Trump, that there are some levers that can be pulled unilaterally that presidents can use to move forward on specific agenda items without congressional approval, and that can influence federal government policymaking through executive actions, regulations, personnel changes. The people that President-elect Biden will choose to put atop federal agencies, I think that really matters, and we can talk about some of that maybe in the Q&A. But a lot of what the president-elect wants to do is going to need congressional approval, and so I have some thoughts on that, and then Chris can tell me what he thinks of those thoughts. The Senate results aren't decided yet, so we've got 2 runoffs in Georgia. What happens with the Senate is key. I think I think most people think it's going to remain in Republican control. And frankly, it's my impression that Americans are quite comfortable with divided control and may have strategically voted in that direction, but I gather that kind of information comes later. It's going to require considerable diplomacy and compromise to get anything through Congress. It's not clear to me that Mitch McConnell has, given how handily he won his own race, and the clear, there's very big support for the Trump agenda across the country, and the fact that Trump may not be going anywhere for a little while. I'm not sure how much incentive he's got to make any deals. And I guess I don't buy, maybe I'm too cynical, but I don't buy the ruminations that Joe Biden's historical close collegial relationship with, Senator Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell is actually going to matter much, because I don't think the political incentives line up for making deals. In the House, even with a Democratic majority, things are going to be messy. I think the election delivered the incoming Biden administration right into a real tug of war that's going to be very hard for him to master, because he needs to couch his policy agenda in such a way that it appeals to the moderate suburbs that in significant part delivered a victory for the Democrats. But he's also needs things for the progressive groups in the cities in the Democratic caucus that also help deliver victory, not to mention his promises to African-American voters. So how's he going to do that? And, I was thinking about the 2022 midterms, and I we're talking about the next 4 years, and I know nobody wants to think to the next set of elections, but that it looks a little scary for Democrats with a slimmer majority. The historical tendency in American politics is clear, is that's the president's party loses seats in the House. And so you have a good chance of the Biden administration facing a completely Republican Congress. And then you have a Supreme Court that has 5 or 6, depending on how you count, Chief Justice, conservative judges. And then add to that this really complicated mix that politics in the US as elsewhere still has a really strong dose of local flavor. And what's going on at the district level has to be really, taken into account in terms of strategizing for policy initiatives, midterm prospects, et cetera. So it's a really complex scenario, and I don't pretend to have it all figured out. But if you're Biden, what's your strategy? Very targeted packages of goodies that hit Republican-dominated districts and states that, you make it hard for them to vote against. We can talk about that maybe in the Q&A.
That's a fantastic overview, Deborah. Really being able to frame all that in such a quick way is impressive, and I think very accurate of the challenges that the Biden administration is going to face. They're not going to have the window. So if we go back in history, go to 2008 with the start of the Obama-Biden administration. They had Democratic control of the House and the Senate. So there was this rare window in American politics, which don't come along very often, where you have unified government in the legislative and executive branch. And of course, that window led to some big policy efforts and the Affordable Care Act in the US, which is, again, one of the biggest, most important pieces of legislation we've seen in generations in the US. And it become a focal point for American politics over the last 10 years. Interesting evolution we could talk about in public opinion and where it stands. But there was a window to do that. There was a window there to try other things. I know Debora focuses a lot on environmental issues. There was a chance at that time to maybe move some climate things that never got through all the way through Congress. And there's a lot of interest to see if indeed the Democrats did take the Senate, if we would have saw that opportunity where aligned government would have allowed for some major policy efforts on climate or healthcare or other areas. That window seems to be fairly closed right now from a legislative perspective, despite, and I agree with Debora, despite Biden's, and this is not trivial, his knowledge of the Senate, his institutional relationships. He's an institutionalist, served as vice president, but his heart's in the Senate very much. And he still has some relations there, but it's a different era than most of the time that he worked in the Senate over the years. I don't minimize those relationships and his ability to try and leverage those to do modest things, but they only go so far. And so we'll see how he can broker some type of legislative agenda with those people like Mitch McConnell and Republican leadership. I'm not that optimistic, which means where do you turn? Where do you turn? And you turn in many ways to the executive powers, the administrative presidency, right? That you look to what you can control. And that is not trivial, as Debora alluded to in American politics, the executive powers of the president in areas like foreign relations, of course. So US-Canada relations could absolutely be impacted significantly by executive powers that come out of the Biden administration. In areas like the environment, certainly we'll see a try to reestablish many of the Obama era policies, regulatory policies that can come out of executive agencies like the EPA and Department of Interior, and really shift some of those policies that went in an absolutely different direction during the Trump administrations. And you'll see that, of course, on things like the Paris agreement and bringing the United States back in. And that's one of the big aspects of a Biden presidency, just the helm of foreign policy, the tenor, the content. And there may be some things we could talk about later that are lasting legacies of the Trump administration in areas like trade policy that absolutely have enormous impacts on US-Canadian relations, and maybe some things that won't shift all the way back to the Obama era and might find some in-between ground based on US public opinion and where the Trump administration is led on some of these issues. So it's certainly going to be challenging. Imagine being tossed in, you're Joe Biden, right? You're coming into a major pandemic, a fiscal crisis, an economic challenge, and Congress that's going to be under at least in all likelihood. We'll see what happens in Georgia, but I agree with Debora, more likely to at least remain under narrow Republican control. And those challenges are big. So I don't envy him on doing that. But just the idea that there is a change in administration should not be for a second minimized because of the power of that office in US politics.
Thank you so much. Those were both great ideas. So we have so many questions coming in, but before we get there, I would just like to ask you guys each just one more question, and then we will get to the Q&A, and I'm really excited about that. So just the next topic that I'd like to talk about is, so what strategies might Canadian policymakers pursue as they begin to work with a post-Trump America? So what does this necessarily mean for Canada?
Chris, do you want to start?
I could start, but as the American, I feel almost obliged to let you go first, Debora. But if you like, certainly, right, as I just mentioned, where are the points of key possible relationships? One I do, and because of my focus more on environmental and energy issues, I do see room for in that particular area for a lot of partnership over the next 4 years with the Biden administration on renewable energy issues, on energy policy and environmental policy, as the U.S. re-engages internationally, first of all, on those issues, how that has an overlap with particular U.S.-Canadian relationships. So it's always been a central aspect of energy policy in the U.S. It's simply the nature of our North American overlay that will be there. So I do think that's one area. On trade, where might we be headed in these relationships? The shifts that the president made in policies, the evolution of NAFTA into its new form. That's not easily kind of shifted back, nor do I think there might be the interest and desire on the part of the Biden administration to fully do that. There's complex relationships with his coalition and labor that I think will make changes there much more nuanced rather than kind of evolutionary flips that we might see. It'll be interesting to hear what Debora thinks about that. The last thing, and it's not to be underestimated, is just the tenor and the comfortable relationships that we'd have. I certainly, like everything related to Donald Trump, nothing is naturally comfortable a lot with relations. He dominates. He sucks the oxygen out of the room. His style is off-putting to almost everybody. Biden certainly, as an individual, and how he'll relate. At first, obviously, with the Trudeau administration, will be more comfortable and relaxed, and that's not to be undersold in terms of its ability to, in relations. I think those intangibles are important. How they form into a, policy or formal relations. I think lots is left to be seen, and I'm sure Debora could add details that I'm missing.
So, I would say, 3 strategies, 3 ways in which Canadians could think about how do you move things forward with the new Biden administration. Given what I said about the fact that we're going to have to maneuver around a pretty conservative national governing architecture. So, I think that's going to be pretty clear. So what do we do? The first thing is that obviously we take very seriously the concerns about the economy, about the skepticism about the global trading regime, the strong strain of economic nationalism that's always been present in the U.S., but is at a particular high right now. It's not going away again. And we've heard a little bit of this in the tone of the incoming administration. So we have to talk the language of jobs creation and partnerships, and just be very cognizant about, some of these concerns. And certainly any package that has to go through the Senate is going to be all about jobs, right? So, that's one thing. It made me think back to a time when I spent a lot of time in the US, in different states, making the argument for closer Canada-US relations. And that was around the time of the Paul Martin administration. So I'm really dating myself, right? So we're mid 2000s. And at that point, Canada's DFATE, as it was called then, so Global Affairs Canada's predecessor, their trade presence was ramped up across all regions of the US. And they had a full court press on trying to highlight how closely, the majority, 2/3 of American states were reliant on trade with Canada. And so they were trying to make that case forcefully across, all regions, and especially in the US South. So, something like that may be needed again. I know that the Trudeau administration has been piloting a program of trade and business promotion, business investment in Canada, and has new trade officers or business promotion officers they've hired them all around the US, and they're out working very hard. But I think we're going to have to wage another sort of Canada promotion campaign, reaching out to our blue wall economic partners that are our closest trade allies, but also to new partners in, so-called Red America and in the US Southwest. This brings me to my second point. So I have long argued that Canada always has to look far and wide and across scales for partners in the US, for strategic partners. Of course, Canada's, I think, an old hand at working through Congress wherever we can, working with agencies at the national level. But this also means spending real quality time at the state and local level, because that's where a lot of moving and shaking is going on. A colleague of ours, Chris and I, have worked with Professor Barry Rabe at the University of Michigan on various projects, and he certainly has long argued that. I completely agree. And some of the most environmentally ambitious states, California, Washington, Oregon, but also some interesting movers and shakers in the US Southwest, they're going to be freed up and maybe better resourced. And I really think it behooves Canada to really get moving on this. I don't think the new administration is going to have all the money it wants, get all the spending, and nor is it going to get any. I just don't believe there's going to be any new legislation. So, it's going to have to operate differently. And I think part of that means getting funds for states to do interesting things. And then I think we can kind of, maneuver our way around that dynamic. Canada already practices what I call diagonality, right? So the Trudeau government has been working with California on things like green infrastructure, automobile emissions, low carbon fuel standards. So I think there should be a full court press on that. And I would say thirdly, working with the US on sort of the post-carbon economy, which again, there's going to be no new legislation, and the Biden administration is not going to get all the money it wants. We're going to work with them on the regulatory front. And we have a long history, a legacy of doing that on methane emissions and vehicle emissions. And, so there should probably be 3 or 4 priorities. Here's what we're going to focus on a regulatory effort, and, go full court press on those.
Thank you so much, Dr. VanNijnatten and Dr. Borick. Those were all some fantastic ideas. So I think at this point, we're going to move into the Q&A portion, because we have some fantastic questions here that I know is going to incite even more great discussion. So the first thing we're going to start with is, I think what everybody is kind of thinking is, we're looking at the US right now, and Trump isn't necessarily wanting to concede. And we're hearing a lot about the election is rigged and all of this. So particularly some of our students at Laurier are curious, what happens if Republicans and Trump supporters refuse to accept the results of the election? And what could this mean for US democracy going forward?
Chris, I'm totally punting to you.
Oh, you take that, Deborah. And this is, boy, I get this question. It's been a dominant question, Kristin. I'm so glad somebody asked it and that you framed it for us. You know, let's take it in a couple of different ways. You know, first of all, what does it mean to accept? You can, you know, the president can say he not concede. He cannot accept. He could rhetorically tweet as much as he wants. There's a reality of US law that doesn't necessarily need acceptance. And that's the certification process. So what happens, to get a little bit into the weeds, is all the states, 50 states in the District of Columbia, they are going to certify over a period. Some are starting already, some are going to be over the next few weeks as the election results are finalized. And they're still not finalized, by the way, including in Pennsylvania. A lot of votes, because of the different processes, are still being counted and added, which are important, by the way. You know, margins and things, it's not going to change any outcomes. I'd be absolutely shocked, even in the closest states like Georgia, if that was the case. There's no historical precedent. So assuming they're all certified, and the states send their delegates. Now, there's been some talk about states not accepting the wills, like Republican legislatures in a place like Pennsylvania not accepting the will of the popular vote. That's not going to happen.
No.
It's not. It would be basically an unbelievable breach of the rules. There's been, again, there was the talk, and I think the president, hunting for avenues, is exploring any kind of strange option, but I would not fear that. So what in all likelihood will happen is in December, the Electoral College will vote. Joe Biden will receive a clear majority of the electoral votes, well into the 300s. And at that point, the writing is on the wall. Now, the president can use lots of, by the way, this is not excluding the president taking all kinds of strange actions, using executive powers to do weird things, including, we'll see what his pardon power does, what executive, announcements. He's already fired lots of people. So don't expect a quiet stretch out of the Trump administration. But ultimately, come January, once that electoral votes are cast, which I am very confident they will be, and Biden will be, he's got to leave. And if he doesn't want to leave the White House, the question is asked, well, do they kick him out? Yeah, they kind of kick him out. The Secret Service, this largely falls to the Secret Service, where they'll say, hey, you got to back up. You don't live here anymore. And it sounds funny and weird that I'm even talking about that. But I'm very confident that's the path that's going to take place. That doesn't mean it'll be linear and quiet, but the structures have largely held very well. The election infrastructure, given a lot of movement during a pandemic, I'm very impressed how it's held up. The president's attempts to cast doubt certainly have found some Republican adherents who don't either want to kind of jump in or at least stay neutral. But the movement under the surface is very much in one direction, and that's to make the transition to a new administration come January.
If I can add something here, I have been watching this, and Chris, being really frustrated about, why aren't Republicans just, you've got a few that have come out and said, it's time to be, graceful and dignified and, move on. There is a charitable explanation for Republican reluctance to say anything right now, and that is to let the process play itself out in a legitimate fashion, so that there will be less tainting. Do you see what I mean? And if you let the lawsuits one by one get turned down at all levels of the courts, if you let states go through their recounts, hand or machine, if you let the certification process go through its, and each state has these incredibly different kind of ways of doing it. If you wait for that to happen, what else can they say? what can Trump say, right? So, it may be that they've made this decision to let this play itself out so that the legitimate process does in the end prevail. So
you cover, just to add for a second, Deborah, that really much, right? If they don't want to seem like they're alienating the president or Republican Trump voters, right? That's such a great point, that you have a lot more cover. Say, look, yeah, I supported the lawsuits, I supported the recounts. They're done.
They failed. Yeah. And watching them fail one by one, like as the days go by and the lawsuits get turned down one by one, and as like even watching as people drift away from the White House or don't come into work, it's all inevitably moving in a certain direction. And Trump may really punish some of these folks in the midterms if they, anyway, we can talk about that.
Great. Okay. So the next batch of questions, I'm going to group a couple of them together, is about polling. So the polls following or leading up to the US election had Biden leading pretty, like it wasn't as calling for as close of an election. So some of the questions are asking about the reliability of polling. So what does this mean for political scientists as far as how we rely on polling? And then one of our questions from one of our Laurier alumni actually highlighted Dr. K's interest in polling and how he was interested in an innovative polling approach called advanced symbolics. And given the discrepancy between the polls and the results in this election, do you think it's time to dispense with traditional polling? So there's a whole lot to unpack there.
There are lots of great questions there, Kristin, and I'm glad you brought in Professor K's interest in polling, right? As someone that's spent time engaged and was looking at ways of innovating, and that's as a field, we always have to be there, right? We have to think how we're going to do this. There's been challenges. As you could tell, I've been around a long time, polled in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania for 25 years, and it's evolved dramatically in my lifetime in terms of methods and challenges. So that's so real, and I'm glad that you framed it that way. The polling picture. Yeah, the narrative is clearly of a polling failure in 2020, that they blew it. And I think it's far more nuanced than that. And that's, you may say, well, you're a pollster, so maybe this is you covering. But I don't think so. I think the results, if you look at it, certainly there were some significant misses in 2020 that repeated some of the misses and problems that were part of the 2016 cycle. Places like Wisconsin, in particular, a place where I started my polling, had an enormous miss. The polls had margins in high single digits. It came out about a 1-point margin, and that repeated. That was probably the worst state in 2020. So something's happening in Wisconsin, which will be interesting to look at. The national polls overstated the president's, even more so than 2016, or understated the president's support. I think in the end, and this is part of it, people started yelling about polling the day after, and the votes aren't even counted, as we'll see. They're moving, especially with the national votes, with places like California and New York counting a lot of ballots. It's probably going to end up around a 4.5, 5, if my numbers are right, and reading others' estimates. The margin had it about +3. That's an off. That you say, well, that's off. It's even more than 2016, but not unusual, right? I mean, if you go back historically and look at polls in the U.S. and in presidential elections, they're usually off 2 or 3 points. Once in a while, they hit it right on. That's more luck, I think, than anything else. It's just the nature of it, of polling. And so, nobody cared. I remember in 2012 when the final poll had Obama at +1 and he won by 4 nationally. Nobody cared except pollsters. We were looking at it. It was like, oh, okay, it's not a big deal. And certainly, so that was off a little bit. But the state picture is very nuanced. There were some really strong polling estimates. Places like North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona had it, Nevada, more or less dead heats. They were pretty close to that, which for polling, which I always think one of the big problems with polling is our expectations are way too high. And this is from a public opinion researcher. We're sampling. Even when you aggregate polls together, you're still, making estimates from small samples to inference about populations. And there, even when it's not a moving target like elections, that's hard. And so I think the polls overall did underestimate Trump's performance again. I'd look at our poll, like our final poll in Pennsylvania. We had Biden up 49-44. It's probably in about a 5-point margin. It's probably going to end up about a 3.5-point margin. In any other cycle, I'd say that's pretty good. We had a normal polling, right? You know, if the final result is 51-48 or something, and we had it 49-44, I go, yeah, good polling cycle. It's the idea that the same kind of repetitive errors occurred in the same direction this time, like 2016, where we overstated the Democrats' performance. So that's where I think the issues are. So yeah, polling certainly has some issues and challenges methodologically to consider. And I like that, you know, you framed it with Barry's work in the past about finding new ways to do that. We certainly have to think about that. But also the idea that polling gave us nothing of value and had a disaster this year, I think is probably a inaccurate narrative. But I'll be interested to hear what Debora has to say.
So I'm not a polling expert, but one thing I made a point of doing was going through the margins of error with my students. So we did go through the actual polls, and you know, and the you know, a lot of the results are within the margin of error, right? So far, some of the polls were, you know, the certainly overstated the support for Democrats in particular states, as Chris said. But, you know, I think people don't look at the margin of error as well as the number of respondents, you know, and don't, you know, take that seriously when they're figuring out, you know, if it's plus or minus 3.5, well, that's a 7-point spread, right? Like, so.
That's great. Thank you so much. So the next question that we have is, it's kind of in a different direction, but it says, how do both parties prepare for the Georgia Senate runoffs? If you were Republican or Democratic campaign managers and analysts, what messaging are you using? What are key aspects that will decide those races?
I'll just say a few things, and I'd be interested to hear Debora's perspective on this. Yeah, the messaging's different, right? You're in a different cycle all of a sudden. It's the same year, a few months later, but now it's framed in kind of the national, like we talk about nationalizing races. This certainly gets even more nationalized in the idea that control of the Senate and the agenda of what happens in Washington is basically channeled through these two elections. There. And so how do you bring those messages in and try to make the case, right? You know, hey, is this a block? You know, if I'm Democrats, or excuse me, I'm Republicans, I'm using the same kind of nationalized, it's Nancy Pelosi, this is your chance to block Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Not so much Biden, you know, in terms of his standing, you know, and his presidency, but to stop Congress from being in the hands of the radical left and socialized presence in America. And that's, you know, you put faces like the Squad, AOC, and the more progressive members of Congress on the ballot, right? That's what you try to do. Now that happens already, but it will be intensified in this. On the Democratic side, I think it's a little more nuanced in terms of the messaging. The idea of, well, look, you know, Georgia, you've gone pretty far here. You've helped, you know, make a change of administrations. If you really want to enable things to happen on healthcare, which is a big issue, and Democrats won on that issue. If you want to make these types of changes, you have to complete the deal. You got to put these two seats in Democratic control, and in essence, if folks know, that's 50-50, and you got the vice president's vote, you know, Vice President Harris, I get to say that, Vice President-elect Harris, as the tie-breaking vote. So I think it's a little harder to make that case because it is a little more nuanced than just trying to raise energy to say, hey, you got to stop Democrats from taking total control. And I think the mood in some ways of America in 2020 was a little bit about that. The president, certainly his brand was damaged. He's lost a big electoral vote. I mean, a popular vote, probably about 5-6 million people really big. So his brand was not great. The Democrats' brand was not great, right? Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and those leaderships, they got some baggage. So you try to Republicans tied to that baggage, and I think it's probably easier. And that's why I think I think Debora alluded to this, and we'll hear what she has to say about it being a little bit more of an uphill battle for Democrats.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, this is a chance for the infrastructure, the voting infrastructure that Stacey Abrams and crew have put together for several years now. Let's see. I think everybody's looking at it. Let's see how strong it is and whether they can get folks out to vote. I think, has anyone seen the ad that Warnock has already put out saying, to try to head off the mudslinging, saying, Warnock, kicks puppies and eats pizza with his hands or something. It was kind of a humorous kind of dig at the Republicans, and the ad essentially says they're going to come at me. So I'm just going to head it off. And then he makes it into a humorous moment. So there's going to be a lot of money. Everybody's already throwing money into that state. So it's going to be, I'm sure, historic in terms of how much money is spent on a Senate race. But I think it's a bit of a test for progressives, right? I think this adds to the messiness and the tension within the Democratic Party of, okay, so here's a test of whether the kinds of policy proposals that progressives want to get put in place, let's see if they actually sell in a place like Georgia, which, there the moderate suburbs were really important. So yeah, and it's going to be very messy because all these national tensions and expectations and conflicts within parties are going to be in full display, and a lot of pressure on local Democrats to get out the vote as well as local Republicans. So
great, thank you. So the next couple of questions are in regards to the US and their multilateral relations on an international stage. So our viewers are wondering, with a Biden administration, are we likely to see an increase in those multilateral relations? So, Trump abandoned many of the multilateral agreements, Trans-Pacific Partnership, NAFTA, for example. So how are the US relations with traditional alliances such as NATO? How are those going to change? And is Biden likely to go in a very different direction than Trump? Or are we likely to see those unilateral relations continue?
Yeah, but lead off this time so I could react to you.
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting who congratulated him first, right? So if you look down the list, Canada, of course, first, and that was interesting, and also the first phone call. So that's an attempt to sort of oh, thank goodness, let's get a better relationship going in place, and then France and Germany, but also some folks, Korea, and around the Middle East, and Russia more reluctant, China more reluctant. And waiting a little bit, a little while. Certainly all indications are from the policy platform that the Biden administration, will re-engage multilaterally in some of the traditional ways. On day one, apparently, re-engage with the Paris Accord and get going on climate again. Strong support for NATO. And that, many, I think, thought that Trump in a second administration might actually torpedo that body. And so that fear will probably go away. Leaders in Europe will be, in an interesting and I think stronger position to move forward on some of the things that they want to do on trade and on green stimulus, et cetera. Some questions about how the UK and Boris Johnson are going to deal with a Biden administration. And so lots of hand wringing there. I was reading in the newspapers over the last few days. So yeah, certainly re-engagement on a whole bunch of different fronts, but don't expect anything concrete for a while because there's real problems at home that Biden's going to have to deal with, right? So re-engaging on another trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Agreement. I mean, I don't expect that to happen, right away, because I think that he's really going to have his hands full. So there might be some re-engagement in terms of diplomacy and, getting everybody calmed down. And yes, we're still here, and yes, we're engaging, but, give us some time because we've got some issues to deal with.
I think that's exactly right, Deborah. The tone, things that we could be certain on, right? The tone, the instincts to engage multilaterally will be very different.
Yeah.
Joe Biden's a different creature in lots of ways from Donald Trump, and his worldview, his desire for relationships, his approach in rhetorical ways, in just personal ways, will be dramatically different, and that's never to be undervalued, right? And I'm not an international relations scholar, but I know those personal things matter. He will, as I think Deborah said very nicely, I think he'll take what he can in terms of executive powers and work with those like the Paris Accord, and where he can make those things, the people he appoints will be dramatically different at state and ambassador positions. And so he will be, for places that President Trump, for lack of better words, had cozier relationships with more autocratic individuals. You will not see that softness, if you will. Biden, that's not part of his approach. He's pragmatic, and he'll know what he has to do in those realms, but he certainly won't be cozy in those places. I think, as you look at back to Deborah's point about his limitations because of so much he has to deal with domestically are real. I don't know how much of a focus he'll be able to have on that. I think it'll be, at least in the short term, kind of a calming presence. Lots of discussions. Hey, we're still here, on things like NATO and foreign multilateral efforts. There'll be a clear sense. I think a catch. You heard this almost from, as you said, from Trudeau to Merkel or Macron. That kind of a sigh of relief almost. Okay, let's breathe. Let's catch our breath. And I think you'll probably see that kind of catch your breath period be the introduction in the first thing, not dramatic sweeping things, just okay, let's kind of reorder ourselves here. But there will be on things like trade, again, where Trump has moved things, it's not necessarily a flip back. Don't expect that because of domestic pressures in other areas. There could be modifications, but a lot of those things I think are moved in a direction that Biden maybe doesn't cement, but certainly doesn't retreat from completely. So it'll be interesting to see.
China is a really interesting case here because, I can't see big changes in terms of changes in how the U.S. is dealing with China. Again, there might be a difference of tone, but I can't see a Biden administration backing off. And I was kind of interested by Canadian government's moves vis-a-vis China and Hong Kong this week, wondering what that signaled, whether it was an acknowledgement that, that the U.S. is not going to change much of its policy toward China, and that Canada, is still stuck between these two, but maybe wants to move a little closer to a Biden administration. And we'll see if, that first phone call, apparently they spoke about, dealing with the Canadians detained in China and Huawei and all of this other stuff going on. So I wonder if that's going to be resolved over the next 12 to 18 months in a way that it would not have been if Trump had been reelected.
So we were just talking about the fact that there's going to be some time for some deep breaths and a little bit of relief. But before that, one of our students wants to know, what can Trump do before he leaves office? And more specifically, can Trump pardon himself before leaving office?
Another weird terrain, Kristin. Questions that I've been dealing with a lot, and I certainly I have no I've never studied this very much, so I've been reading up on it. I've never pardon powers are interesting to begin with, and the history of their use by American presidents is fascinating. So really interesting space. But we've never had a president pardon himself or I believe his family members. We've had a president, the most historic pardon was of Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon back in the 70s. In a very, I'd love to, that's really, I'm a big fan of Gerald Ford. I think historically underrated. And I think he did so knowing that it would have political peril for him, but to try and, as he said, remove the country from its long national nightmare. So does Trump try to get rid of his own possible nightmare by pardoning himself? I would put it not a second past him to do that, right? He's shameless. This is as an evaluator. He doesn't, norms don't matter to him. So would he try to do that? Potentially, would it standing hold? I have no idea. I really don't. I've heard different from people that know judicial processes and pardon powers lots more, saying it's mixed in terms of its standing. One important thing to look at, and Deborah was alluding to, the role of federalism, right, in American life. A lot of these potential charges for him are at the state level in New York. So pardons don't work there.
No.
That's where federalism, those lines are important. So he can do certain things, but it doesn't give him kind of a blank check. But my gut from watching this person for a long time is that he'll certainly try if he can. And it'll be interesting to see. He'll toss these around in lots of other places too. Watch, it'll be kind of epic pardoning going on for all kinds of
pardoning.
It will be. These are the things that he controls the powers, right? What does he have left? So pardon power is something he's got control over, and he's got 2 months to toss it out there. So it'll be interesting. Go ahead, Deborah.
Well, so I did some reading on this too, because I was fascinated with the question. But, there is a 1970s Justice Department memo around the time of Nixon that did look into the question of whether Nixon could pardon himself. They came to the conclusion that it would not be appropriate. But there isn't any obvious jurisprudence on this. And so legal scholars are weighing in, but you would have to anticipate what he's going to pardon himself for. And so that's a little complicated, because there's a long list of things that are pending. And some of those things, as Chris said, are at the state level, and there his pardon powers are. He's impotent in that sense. So I think that's going to be some real political theater.
Guaranteed. Yeah, mm-hmm. He guarantees right now that the political theater will be there.
So one of our next questions is about, what do the Republicans have to learn from this so-called political theater? Will this affect their definition of the definition of what their base is?
So, the suburbs, that's a really big message, is that they can't get over their sort of solid base without the much more moderate suburbs, and the suburbs are changing. So, if they want to win in the suburbs around Houston and Austin and, big cities in Pennsylvania and the, around the Great Lakes and all over the country, they're going to have a better game plan. I'll tell you though, I think one of the game plans was borne out. Chris, you can tell me what you think about this. That so far the Republicans have flipped 9 House seats. 7 of those were women candidates. That is very strategic. I think women are seen as more moderate. And they're viewed differently than male candidates. And I have to think that was, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but, I think this was a strategy that they used to good effect and could very well use again. But they've got to do something different in the suburbs.
Oh, I agreed on both counts. I think it was strategically a good move on the part of Republicans. emphasize women on these ballots in areas they've struggled, and it did. I think it helped. It helped as part of their success. But you're absolutely right. The suburbs. It's hard to keep a coalition together, a successful winning coalition at the presidential or state level in the U.S. without the suburbs. I looked and did deep in Pennsylvania data now, and the president did an amazing job. If anybody knows much about Pennsylvania politics, I don't know how much you do. It's got one of the biggest rural populations in the country. If you've ever driven across Pennsylvania coming south, you'll know it's long, lots of rural landscapes, and a couple big cities, right? Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Trump did an amazing job getting turnout in the rural areas again, even more so than 2016. And I predicted, a lot of our models said, yeah, he's got, he's expanded registration. But my argument was, as long as the cities turn out and he can't win the suburbs, the math's not there this time. And the suburbs, just take a look at the results in the 4 suburban Philadelphia counties. It was 2-1 in most of them for Biden, and the size of the pie was bigger. And that math's daunting in Pennsylvania. Yeah. You just can't turn out enough rural voters if you can't cut into the suburbs. And he couldn't cut into the suburbs in lots of places, in Phoenix and Atlanta and others. And that truly, if you're looking for, there's so many causes, right? We can't have a silver bullet. It was black vote and some of the things we talked about, Hispanic vote, actually allowing in some states Trump to be more competitive or even win. But that suburban vote, it's for Republicans to keep kind of majorities is crucial.
And that suburban vote is less white. It's much more diverse, and it's getting younger. And that really matters, especially if you look, I took a look at some of the exit polling, and it's, women, younger voters, and then seniors who got scared, at Trump. And so, they're going to have a different strategy for the midterms for sure.
So some of our questions ask then, what happened to that supposed blue wave, and how far do you see things such as race, especially white anxiety, supremacy, driving support for Trump? And if it's not that, what else might be driving support for Trump? Why did the Republicans do as well in this election versus what we thought they might have?
Yeah, Kristin, disentangle a little bit, right? Trump and Republicans, right? And some of the messaging that I think Trump tried to take over the top about, they're coming for your suburbs, given him as the messenger wasn't necessarily going to help him in ways, because so much sunken cost and sunken views on him already, and it's hard to necessarily move. And he can only do so much, being that he's this established figure and people have views. But kind of that messaging on the margin for other Republicans in some suburban districts, and especially as Deborah said, many of them women candidates, were able, I think, to carve out a little space on those issues and security issues that probably benefited Republicans. I think the idea, you look at things like social policy in the US, and obviously we've seen an evolution on things like the Black Lives Matter movement. A majority of individuals have a positive view of it right now, but you have to start parsing, right? Black Lives Matter versus, some of the rhetoric on defunding the police and those types of policies, which I think in the end were actually a liability for some suburban Democratic candidates, and that Republicans were able to play off that. And their messaging, if you looked at it, was pretty much there. They weren't saying, anything anti-Black Lives Matter, but they were trying to cast Democrats, like here in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, in places like the 1st Congressional District. It's a very suburban district, and it has the most moderate, I think, member of Republican in Congress right now. That was his angle, right? And the ads coming in for him that, hey, that's too much, right? By the way, that guy Fitzpatrick didn't mention Trump once. He couldn't distance himself far enough from Trump. Doesn't want to have any of that carried over with him. In fact, his ads were how much he different on environmental issues. That's the issue he picked to separate himself from Trump. But on issues like, defunding the police, he used those as his leverage point.
Yeah, and I don't know how easy it is to separate out then the basic economic angst, that I think was probably, underlying lots of different districts and some of the dynamics. But, it's, I would say, Chris, it's not a longer term strategy for them. Right? Like, if you look at demographics and how things are going and the decreasing proportion of the white vote and, the increasing proportion of Asian Americans and African Americans as a proportion of the electorate. And of course, it's different regionally, but the long-term strategy is going to have to be not that kind of stuff. And I think, more on sort of policy issues that are able to rise above, those kinds of issues, I think, that rise above and speak to a more diverse electorate. Maybe that's optimistic, but I don't think that can be used for too much longer.
No, demographically, you're absolutely right. You just see the numbers and the voters that just came in, by the way, the kind of Gen Z folks that just for the first time this year is that group majority minority part of the electorate for the very first time, and that wave's coming next, are moving that way. So as the oldest generations leave the electorate and these new generations come in, it is a dramatically, just even in 20 years to see the share of non-white voters in the United States, and we're kind of on that bubble where it gets a little bit every time that we're moving.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder, which because there must be Republicans thinking about this. Who are they, and what kind of strategies are they thinking about? Because so far they do not have the voice of the party.
They did an autopsy back in the after the Bush years to kind of identify that, right? And then the diagnosis was we got to do better among Latinx voters in the U.S. They mostly didn't, right? They had some marginal among Cuban Americans and others in places, but they lost 2/3 of that vote. You can't keep as that pie grows of Latino voters and Asian voters, two fast growing groups in the United States. As those pies grow, you can't continue to lose 70%, 75%, like you do with Asian votes. You just can't. So you have, if you're going to be a majority party in the US, mathematically, you're going to have to do better. You just can't find this many white voters and say, I will just increase the margin there. It's not going to happen. It just won't happen.
Yeah. So our next question comes from one of our PhD students, and she would like to know, so she says that this morning, the news reported that Republican Senators Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell have shown signs of breaking rank with other Republicans by agreeing that the president-elect should receive daily intelligence briefings during the transition. Would you interpret that as any indication of their willingness to accept and work with a Biden administration?
I don't know what that says. I think that might just be, trying to help Trump come to terms with this. At some point, there's a national security problem.
Yeah, it is, and that's where Graham. They're both realists. Graham's, he goes everywhere because he's a political survivalist. Yeah, and he's shown that in unbelievable ways over the last few years. But on kind of security issues, he still has kind of a pragmatic streak to him, and he doesn't want to jeopardize that. And I think that's a nudge, right? They're treating Trump like the petulant individual, the child. I'm glad you said it. And so they're trying to placate him in some ways. And so they're sending signals. You're sending signals, and for them, that's like, okay, it's probably not going to catch his attention or irritate him. We'll say, like Graham will say a couple things about, oh yeah, we got to check all these things and badmouth Philadelphia and others. But at the end, they know, and so now they're trying to send ways that they can suggest that, okay, we got to at least move marginally in that direction. And so, yeah, it's an orchestrated way of kind of moving the ball slowly in that direction, which we know it's headed.
I would completely agree with Chris, but I think embedded in that was a question about whether this is a signal for the future. I think those two they're just going to issue by issue. They're just going to see how it benefits them. And I don't think this is, I think if anything, it just shows that they're very utilitarian and, so, yeah. So they're just going to go issue by issue, across time. I don't think it signals any kind of willingness to work with Biden, even though we've got, Lindsey Graham saying how great he is.
Yeah, I agree. And they, truly, they don't like Trump. They don't. Mitch McConnell. I mean, they know what they have to deal with and utilize it. I mean, deep down, Lindsey Graham, he's done what he sucked up to Trump in the ways he had to do to survive. But I'd love to hear someday his actual thoughts on Donald Trump.
I don't know if we'll ever know.
No, not until he's out of office.
There'll have to be a tell-all book or something like that.
Yeah, we got enough and more are coming.
So our next question then leads from, so if the Republicans aren't willing to work with Biden, then how are the Democrats, how do Democrats resolve the deep divisions that exist within their party right now, especially given the recent public nature of inter-party politics? How is Biden going to be successful?
Yeah, it's messy. I said that in some of my opening comments. I've been watching Twitter pretty closely and, watching the Democrats among themselves tweet out at one another about, whether progressive ideas delivered voters or actually served as an obstacle in particular districts. And, I see quite a conservative, as I said, a congressional architecture that isn't going to be a really good germinating place for progressive ideas. And I, as I said before, I think Georgia is going to be, people are going to be looking at Georgia as a bit of a test of that. But Biden's going to have to speak to both, but, I think the Senate is going to hand him some excuse to maybe not move on some elements of the progressive agenda because he knows they won't go through, right?
Yeah, it's right. The reality of what you can do with the agenda now is completely changed. And in some ways, this sounds weird, having a Republican Senate gives him a little bit of a
cover.
Pass there to say, look, let's not put up stuff just to say and maybe harm ourselves if it's something that's not as popular. And I think Biden, Biden has limitations like any person. He's got some strengths, right? And his ability as kind of a pragmatist and a centrist. I think he in finding ways to keep that messaging out there and use his capital in that area, while at least being attentive to the needs of the progressives and to acknowledge on the front and to make the case, like, let's go back to climate issues, right? He's going to make major additions there and make the case, right? Look, I've reinstated a lot of Obama era energy policies, regulatory policies. I've re-engaged us in Paris. These are big things, folks, like he likes to say, they're big things. And so don't minimize those for folks on the left and the progressive front. On social issues too, really taking kind of the lead both rhetorically and moving on issues, things like police reform in a way that has positive ground. So it's kind of selling to the left that I'm acting on this, folks. I'm doing what I can, in my realm with trying to preserve our big umbrella. And I think he's capable in there. We'll see. It's going to be challenging. I don't doubt for a second those tensions are real. As Deborah said, I'm watching them. I'm listening to them play out, in places like Pennsylvania. It's it's what's fascinating. I'll just say quickly, we got really, because of the outcome, both parties think they won something and both parties think they lost. And those divisions are going to be ripe on both sides. On the Republican side, the Trumpist versus kind of the how do we form a majority versus the Democrats with the progressives and the moderates. So it's from my perspective as someone that studies American politics, this coming out of this election has been unlike anything I've seen because both parties are kind of in that place. So how that all comes into the mix is going to be fascinating.
I mean, I think for the person who asked the question, watch the cabinet posts.
Yeah.
So watch who Biden appoints, and we know that he does this very personally. Like it's not like he's taking advice, but you know, just like in his vice presidential pick, you know, he's the top one. He's taking in advice, but he's going to make these decisions, and those are going to be real clues to how he's going to move forward, right? So where does he put progressives? Where does he put moderates? Where does he put a few Republicans? Will he take anyone from Congress? The party doesn't want him to because they're going to have a thin, right? So if he looks outside of Congress, there's some really high profile state people, and who are they? What are their backgrounds? Are they diverse? You know, I'm going to be watching that because it's going to be, again, fascinating to see the signals that are sent through those cabinet posts.
Great point. Great point.
So we only have time for a couple of more questions. So we're going to bring it back to the Canadian context a little bit. And one of our students want to know, how will the Biden administration affect the economy of Alberta in terms of the Keystone XL pipeline and as well as the Canadian oil sector?
I defer to my Canadian colleague.
Oh, you know what? I have both too much to say on this and not enough. So the oil sectors, you know, COVID was not the first blow. So this is a sector that has been ailing for a while. We can trace it back a decade or more in terms of the way the price of oil's been going, fights between OPEC and other oil producers in terms of an inability to limit oil production. Prices have been kept low. COVID really struck a blow in terms of demand, but that demand was already declining. The U.S. Output because of fracking has gone way up. They don't need Canadian oil to the same extent. Add to that, you know, some of the big investment houses have been backing away from fossil fuels, worried about stranded assets, worrying about lower demand as governments turn to different forms of green energy. This is a long-term story that I think some people are not acknowledging because of the short-term context. You know, I'm sure this isn't lost on anyone in Alberta, but the conditions that obtained in, you know, with the recession 2007, 2008, 2009, right? Those conditions don't obtain. It is not the same context. And there, you know, stimulus funds in Canada and the US went to the fossil fuel industry and bypassed the green industry. And I don't think that's going to happen again. And the fossil fuel industry knows that. So we have a huge problem on our hands, and Alberta has a huge problem on its hands. And it's a nationwide problem that we have to come to grips with. How are we going to support a province that is so reliant? It's not just Alberta, but significant parts of Saskatchewan, Newfoundland. You know, we're not having the deep, dark discussions that we need to be having on this in terms of supporting Alberta through this transition process. There's little moves. You know, I have no doubt that the Trudeau government is wringing its hands over this. But the Biden win now means that the fate of that industry is even more perilous. And the partners they thought they might have are fading away in the US. It also strengthens the hand of those who want more progressive climate policy in Canada. It's a little bit of a stark assessment, but yeah, I think this really changes the game and accelerates a process quite seriously that was already underway. I don't know. What do you think, Chris?
No, I'm just happy I got to hear Debora talk about this. This is right in her wheelhouse, and it seems exactly my macro level takeaway is that Biden's win certainly does nothing to change, to improve the possibilities for places like the prairie provinces in terms of those oil possibilities. There's nothing there that gives me the sense of that. It's interesting to see how it plays out stateside, right? A place like Pennsylvania with fracking right now. A lot of those communities, boy, I mean, all the things you talked about on the broader economic factors, Debora, have played out here. I mean, the industry is really hurt. A lot of it's COVID related. A lot of it was just simply the energy markets and the price for that really changing. We had companies before COVID, some of the big fracking companies in the state go into bankruptcy. Those local economies have been very much affected by it. So these things are big beyond the change of administration. So all the things you said really are fascinating and important. Well done.
Well, there's no political downside for stopping Keystone. Like, the US doesn't care. It doesn't want the oil. Like, there's no downside. It cost Biden nothing to deliver to progressives a no on Keystone, but it cost Alberta everything. So, the incentives are just all in the wrong direction for the oil industry on this one. The other I think little interesting piece there, I did a look at investment in green energy in Texas, Arizona, places like that. Who's the biggest investor in green energy in Texas? The oil and gas industry. Like, let's just contemplate that for a minute, right? I'll leave it there. That's the signal.
That was a big one. So I'm imagining this might be our last question because it's a biggie and we could probably go all sorts of directions with it. I want to apologize to anybody who didn't get their questions answered today. We had so many fantastic ones, but I think today we're going to end off on what, if at all, was the impact of COVID-19 on the American election? What would you assess the impact to be, if any?
It's an enormous question, and I polled a lot on this, Kristin, and I think it was of course impactful. And you could ask the question. I think this is a fair question to answer. Does Donald Trump win without COVID this year? And I think that's
scary.
It's a distinct possibility. It is just the idea that, where we were, our poll, and we polled earlier this year in Pennsylvania, and it was pretty much a dead heat. And it was at a weird time. It was before COVID. Biden was struggling when we matched him up. He was just coming out of kind of those struggles in the primaries, and the president had survived impeachment. And so but it was pretty even. It was dead even. And so the economy was good, right? He had all those things going for him. And so I think it's a different race. We did see all throughout the fall, we asked Pennsylvanians in our polls, how did you think the president's handled the issue? A majority of likely voters gave him the worst possible rating.
Yeah.
The worst possible rating. And the issue was among the top three, often number two, right behind the economy in voters when we asked them to pick their priority issue. So think about that. The confluence of a very salient issue and the worst possible ratings of your handling of it. You layer in among seniors who are disproportionately affected by it and are among the biggest voting blocs in states like Pennsylvania, which are among the oldest in the US. That's a bad cocktail to take into an election season. And so my kind of indicator right now where we stand, just before we get in all the data, is that it played a significant role. Was it determinative? I don't think that's a reach in the end to perhaps claim it is. Well, we need more analysis, as you can guess from the cautious scholar. But I think for certain it was impactful and quite possibly determinative.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Chris there. You know, it took a bunch of variables that seemed to be in the plus factor for Trump, the support of seniors, right? A good economy. And remember, he kept making that argument that the unemployment rate for African Americans was at the lowest it had been in a very, very long time, if not historically low, right? And he was making that argument. My administration has been good for various groups of voters. And so, you know, that got turned on its head, because then what did we see? We saw a lot of political ads. I like watching political ads that really focused on African Americans being at greatest risk for COVID, being a disproportionately large portion of healthcare workers, frontline workers, and also disproportionately economically affected. And it took an economy that was looking good for Trump and it turned it right on its head. And it also put Republican administrations all across the country in really awkward positions. And very high profile Republican administrations in Texas, in, you know, in various Southwestern states, but also in, you know, sort of red America or middle America, who had to flip and say, okay, well, I guess we do need restrictions. I guess we didn't do the right thing. You know, and that helped, I think, throw fuel on the fire that was already under Trump's feet, because it was not a unified Republican, this is fine, it's going to be okay. And so then you had a breaking of ranks, and I think that really injured him. And, you know, had COVID not been there and done that, you know, sort of within Republican ranks, there would have been much more unified resistance, I think, to what Democrats were proposing on the healthcare front and, you know, some of these other ideas. Kristin, you've done such a great job of moderating.
Well, thank you. Thank you so, so much. I want to say thank you to both of our fantastic panelists for all of your insightful thoughts and your expertise around what has been a very busy and overwhelming election period. And I think, as we can see, it's not over yet in many, many different ways. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. I know that Barry would have absolutely loved this conversation and could have added to it in so many ways. So we miss him dearly. And thank you so much to Betty and all of the organizing, supporting organizations that made today possible. And I look forward to more of these events in the future. So thank you to everybody.